All right, good afternoon, or morning or evening, wherever it happens to be in your corner of the world, and welcome to this Toradex webinar on getting a head start on the EU's Cyber Resilience Act compliance with embedded Linux. This is my second in a series of webinars about the Cyber Resilience Act. If you have already seen the first one, great. But I should say that this webinar is not about explaining in great detail what the CRA is or sort of getting into a ton of questions about the Act itself. This is a more technical focused talk on how you can leverage technical solutions provided by Toradex to meet specific concrete requirements, as well as requirements that might emerge from threat modeling. So if you would like more detail and information on what the CRA is on a more legal level, regulatory level, I recommend taking a look at that previous webinar. The recording is available on the web. I'll first introduce myself. My name is John Oster. I am a product cybersecurity architect for Toradex. I have a long background in cybersecurity, particularly in software update systems. Originally in automotive. I've been with Toradex for about 3 years, and I've been focusing on this CRA compliance topic for us. So with that, let me just get into the overview of what we will be looking at in the this webinar today. The goal is to first understand how the CRA's text and requirements relate to technical requirements that your engineering department will have to implement. In particular, I'm going to look at software and data integrity, at-rest encryption, so secure boot, cryptographic device identity and attestation, and secure software updates. And time permitting, although in my practice run-throughs I don't think it's likely to, but if we end up having the time, I may get to some application security topics as well. If not, well, there may be a future webinar on that. So first things first, I would like to start off with a little survey. One of the things about the CRA is that you're required to do some risk assessment and threat modeling, and so I would like to survey everyone here on which of the following threats or risks you will particularly need to address or mitigate in your next project, and you can select as many as are applicable. So the first one I have is CAPAC 37. That would be either intellectual property or credential exposure from the device. Second, we have CAPAC 184, so general attacks on software integrity. That would be things like having an attacker able to modify the software running on the device or execute untrusted or unauthorized code. CAPAC 151, that would be identity spoofing or impersonation. If you have, so examples of that would be if you have some cloud service that the device connects to and you want to be sure that only the devices themselves are connecting, this threat would be an attacker managing to impersonate a device. And then fourth is CAPAC 186. It's a big, broad one, but just generally malicious software updates. So please select as many as you want. I'll give this maybe another 10 seconds or so, and I'll show the results in a minute. But while it's running, I want to just give a little bit of background on the Cyber Resilience Act. Again, this is not, I'm not going to go into detail on what it is. Please reference the previous presentation for this. But you should know a little bit about what the CRA requires of you. And one of the first questions you might want to ask is, am I actually affected? I imagine if you're in this webinar, you realize you are affected, but just for completeness, I'm going to close the poll here so you can see my slides again. Are you affected by the CRA? The answer is yes. The text of the CRA says that all products that have any digital elements whose intended and reasonably foreseeable use includes a direct or indirect logical or physical data connection to a device or network. So it's guaranteed to be covered. So you need to be thinking about compliance for this already. And today, this is what we're going to focus on: what you can do technically to get in front of your compliance obligations. And there are kind of three major areas here to talk about. I won't be discussing vulnerability handling and monitoring requirements here. What I'm going to focus on are the first and the third elements on this slide. So the CRA has some very specific product requirements. So these are specific things that the CRA says you must implement. And then the CRA also has these general principles of cybersecurity by design. And these are principles that you see in a lot of other cybersecurity frameworks or regulations, NIS 2, even ISO 27001, things like this, where you have to define a threat model for your device or your product, do some risk analysis, and then implement controls that mitigate those potential risks. So the technical measures I'm going to be talking about today are either going to be specific requirements that the CRA just says, hey, you've got to do this, or they're going to show you some, they're going to be mitigations for particular risks, so controls that you can implement technically to satisfy this need for mitigating a particular risk inside your threat model. I seem to have missed my slide on the results of the poll, so I will just tell you right now. I see from the results here, okay, all of our 4 responses were well over 50%. The number one concern were attacks on software integrity, closely followed up by malicious software, and there's also nearly 70% of you said that you were concerned about exposing intellectual property or credentials. And then coming in at 55%, we had spoofing or device impersonation. That sounds about in line with what I would expect. I'll note that some of the things the CRA says and requires, you do have to interpret in context. So if you have a device that is not intended to be connected to the internet, you don't have to necessarily worry about device identity spoofing because you're not authenticating remotely, things like that. All right, let me dive into, however, our first product-related essential requirement, data and application integrity. This is one that is referenced specifically in the CRA. It says that all products shall, quote, protect the integrity of commands, programs, and configuration against any manipulation or modification that is not authorized by the user. So what do we mean when we say integrity protection? And this is the format I'm going to go with for each of these requirements. We're going to do a little bit of talk about theory and background, and then we're going to look at what risks or threats are related to this, and what controls you can implement to meet the requirements of this. So integrity protection is well, it's what it sounds like, making sure that the software on the system or the data and configuration on the system is what it's supposed to be. There are, however, some subtleties and some levels to this. So generally speaking, we have 3 levels of integrity protection. We have install time protection, or install time integrity checking. And this would be when you, for example, install software or a firmware image onto a device, you would generally need to do some integrity checks at that time. There's also I'm taking the example of a file system here, startup time or load time integrity, where you check the integrity of some artifact, file system, whatever, when it's first loaded into the system, for example, on boot up or when it's mounted. And then the third level of integrity protection, which is generally also the strongest one, is continuous or access time integrity. And this is integrity checking that happens continuously in the background whenever any part of the file system is accessed, or any range of bytes in a block device, for example. So again, we have, if we're checking the integrity before installing the image, that's an install time check. If we are checking when we mount the image, but not continuing to check fully on every access, that's a startup time check. And finally, an access time check is, or a continuous, the continuous integrity system is one that makes sure that whenever the asset is loaded into memory, whenever it's accessed, you actually are checking the integrity at that moment. It's the strongest because it avoids time of check, time of use vulnerabilities. All right, so a little more theory here. We're going to talk principally in this section about what's commonly called secure boot or measured boot. And secure boot is, if it's implemented as a full chain of trust, it's all about access time integrity. So a full secure boot implementation does give you this. Sometimes you will see people referring to, just checking the integrity of the bootloader or boot container image, or the bootloader and kernel as constituting secure boot. In the context of this, I'm generally meaning secure boot to be a system that protects end-to-end. And you typically implement it in a chain. There are other approaches to this, but I think the strongest architectural implementation is to have a chained secure boot process for various reasons. And it's implemented, going in reverse order, using kernel subsystems. So FS Verity and DM Verity to verify the root file system anytime you're accessing a file or a range of bytes on a block device. And then the Linux kernel, which is responsible for doing the verification of the root FS, is verified by a hardened bootloader. And the bootloader is ultimately verified by some immutable ROM code that comes from the SoC. So you have this chain of trust that extends from the very first moment of booting. The SoC has some keys permanently burned into it that you use to sign your bootloader image. The bootloader image contains the public keys that are used to sign the kernel fit image, and the bootloader verifies the fit image before loading it. And then finally, the Linux kernel config or other elements baked into the kernel are used to load and verify that root FS. So you have this chain of trust that extends all the way to the root FS. So that's how it works. Why do we want to do this? Apart from the fact that the CRA tells us to, well, essentially tells us to. here's our threat model. There are a lot of detailed threats that Secure Boot protects against, but these I've selected kind of some of the big broad ones. So one of the most obvious threats is that the attacker flashes or loads some malicious firmware, or tries to modify a running image or something like that. The control that we have here is that, well, we have two controls against that particular threat. The first one is an install time check that we'll get to a little bit later when we're talking about secure software update systems. And the second check is Secure Boot itself. So as we saw in the theory section, we have this hardware root of trust that gets layered on top to ensure that everything chains back to some immutable trust anchor inside the SoC. And what ultimately happens if even if the attacker, if an attacker tries to, overwrite an image with some a firmware with some malicious image, the device simply won't boot. If the attacker attempts to, even as root, modify a file on a DM-Verity or FS-Verity protected file system, it will simply fail. It's not possible to do. So you have a quite strong control against these attacks. This is pretty strongly correlated with what the CRA specifically requests you to do. There are other threats, though, that Secure Boot really helpfully protects against, and one of the most important ones is persistence. So the threat here is that an attacker exploits something higher in the stack. So you have some bug in your application. Let's say it allows a privilege escalation and some remote code execution. If you don't have Secure Boot in that situation, usually the first thing that the attacker is going to do is establish some persistence mechanism, install a rootkit, something that makes sure that even if the device goes offline for a while, is turned off, rebooted, whatever, the attacker will still have control and still be running their software and be able to easily access it again when the system boots again. Secure Boot is really important for recovery from attacks here as well. Because with Secure Boot, the attacker doesn't have this capability of getting persistence. So because you have this full chain of trust verifying everything, when you reboot the system, the attacker would have to exploit it again to gain the access again, and their access goes away every time the system reboots. And this is really beneficial when combined with the software update system, because it gives you the capability of having this control, this mitigation against this type of attack that allows you to update the software to address the bug. So even a very severe vulnerability can be recovered from via update if you also have strong integrity protection all the way through. It's also important to consider the key management in our threat model. So as we saw in the diagram, there are this chain of keys signing for the integrity of each subsequent stage. So what happens if an attacker manages to, let's say, infiltrate your software supply chain and get their hands on a signing key? Well, a properly implemented full chain of trust Secure Boot solution also provides some controls and mitigations against this. So this is kind of the big reason we use a chain rather than using the base hardware features to sign everything in the boot stack. If we have an attacker who has compromised the key that's used for signing the root file system, we still have a mitigation. We can change the kernel image via a software update and have the kernel use a different key to verify the booting image. So then the key that the attacker had control of is no longer particularly useful to him, as long as you manage to promptly update the devices in the field that would otherwise be trusting the key. A similar story if the attacker manages to get control of the next key up the chain. If they compromise the key that the bootloader, the private key associated with the public key that the bootloader uses to verify the fit image, the kernel. With Torizon Cloud, with Optane, you can also safely update the bootloader, and the bootloader contains that key, so you can rotate your trust via remote software update. Again, giving you recovery and mitigation. And then finally, there's even protection if the attacker comes into possession of one of the superroot keys, these hardware-bound keys that you fuse in that sign the very earliest stages. This is the most difficult one to deal with, but it is still possible. You can fuse up to 4 keys, or for some modules up to 8 keys, into these one-time programmable fuses, and then you can via special firmware that you can deliver via an over-the-air update, you can revoke the currently active key and move on to the next one. This is not super easy to do, but it's very possible in this absolute worst case scenario where the attacker gets in control of even the absolute root of trust. And incidentally, this also shows why you want a chained secure boot solution. I'm just maybe going to go back to this diagram where you have different keys for each stage, because in the event of a compromise, you don't want to have to revoke everything. It's a lot easier to switch up your kernel command line to pass a different hash than it is to update the bootloader, and it's much easier to update the bootloader than it is to revoke a one-time programmed key, especially in the field. So I believe that covers our risks, threat model, and controls for this. I want to talk now a little bit about implementation and how practically you can do it. For a high-quality secure boot implementation, typically, if you are doing it in-house, I took some surveys of some customers of ours and gotten my own contacts in the industry to get these numbers. You might be looking at an internal implementation of somewhere between 6 and 12 weeks of an FTE to get everything up and running. If you hire an external consultancy to do it, the numbers I've seen quoted, again, depending on exactly how you implement it and what's included, might be 10 to 50K in euros. What can we do to help you here? Well, we've done all of this and support all of this directly for effectively all of our modules that support Torizon. So only excluding the very low end ones are constantly tested, and we have the implementation done and ready to go. So if you want to implement Secure Boot on a Toradex SOM, you don't need to go into pages and pages of NXP documentation to find out exactly the protocol you need for fusing keys and how to partition everything, how to configure the SPL to load your boot objects in the correct order, everything like that. It's implemented for you. You can. It's a 3-step process. You have to generate your keys, of course. That's something that is specific to the SoC manufacturer. So there's slightly different tooling for NXP versus our TI chips. But we also provide our own documentation on how to use those tools. And then you just need to add 2 lines of config to your Yocto build, and then follow some again, follow these SOC-specific instructions for actually fusing the keys. How long this actually takes to get it up and running, I conservatively said 4 hours. I gave it to one of our interns and had him go from zero, just looking at the documentation, no external help, and he was done in about 2 hours and 15 minutes without having to go any further than our help. And you can see also from our community forum, people are successfully implementing this on real world projects all the time. I've put a link to the documentation on this slide as well as a QR code here. So yeah, this is one of the really key advantages you can get by using Toradex hardware and our whole software ecosystem. You get implementations like this that otherwise would potentially slow down your time to market and add cost to your development cycle. We really have done that for you. You can also even, if you like, take some benefit from this. If you're not using Toradex hardware, all of this implementation is open source. Of course, you'll have to adapt it to other hardware, but hopefully, just having this stuff out there in the open is also a general good for the community. That being said, of course, it's always going to be an easier path on our own modules because that's what we test and continuously support. All right. I see I'm a little bit behind my internal schedule here, so I'm going to try and speed up a little bit and move on to our next specific requirement that the CRA imposed. The CRA says that products shall protect the confidentiality of stored, transmitted, or otherwise processed data, personal or other, such as by encrypting relevant data at rest or in transit by state-of-the-art mechanisms and by using other technical means. So this is one where it's kind of on the border between a risk analysis threat model based requirement and a concrete requirement in the Act. If you aren't storing any personal data on the device, you don't have to implement encryption, obviously, and there may be other appropriate controls, but the CRA very strongly indicates that you should use at-rest encryption of data. So what does that mean? Oh no, I forgot. I forgot to share the results of the previous poll here. Okay, so when we're talking about encryption at rest, what is the threat we're actually looking at? I mean, there's various ones, but when it comes down to it, the threat is somebody dumps the data off of the internal storage of your device, and if you happen to be using an SD card or something like that, it's very easy to just go and read the contents. But a lot of people think that soldered NAND or eMMC is much harder, and it's probably not that realistic for just an average Joe to read it. So this is what this poll is about. How long do you think it would take an amateur to desolder a standard eMMC chip, dump its full contents, and then reattach it so that the device worked again? And yeah, I put up a few options: more than a day, 4 to 8 hours, 2 to 4 hours, 1 to 2 hours, or less than an hour. I mean, I heard some estimates in the past of, I'm sure it takes somebody with a specialized lab at least a week or something like that. I think people, probably most of you, are a little more realistic about this, but still, I think there's a broad assumption that this is not a super easy thing to do. I'm gonna give this 3 more seconds and then close the poll. And I'm gonna share the results here, hopefully. Okay, so we got about 15% thought that it would be more than a day's work. with kind of even stuff. But I will say that only 22% got the right answer here of less than an hour. I included this because I found this quite nice article just last week. The cost of a NAND chip-off attack is 170 euros. And to quote directly from that article by Guillaume Guéret, so how much expertise, time, and money do you really need to perform a chip-off attack on a BGA eMMC NAND nowadays? Well, I tried. The expertise required is not impressive. The time was literally 30 minutes, and the total cost was 170 euros and 87 cents, with quite a lot of room left for optimization. I have put the link to that article. It's an enlightening read if you were among the people who thought it would take more than a day, how easy this is to do with tooling. So what I mean to say here is that you probably do want to consider at-rest data encryption as part of your, as one of your controls or mitigations, either to protect your IP or especially if your device needs to have some credentials in it. It's unfortunately often the case that you're dealing with some authentication system that doesn't have the flexibility to use strong cryptographic providers of credentials, and so your device needs to have some credentials on it. One example that we see fairly often are the credentials to a private Docker registry. In Torizon OS, you can run your applications in and deploy them in Docker containers. So a lot of our customers choose to use private Docker registries to avoid publicly exposing their the application software running in containers, and then the credentials need to go on the device somewhere. Docker by default stores those in a JSON file on the disk, and so an attack like that chip-off attack would get the private Docker Hub credentials and allow the attacker to extract them and have access to the private Docker Hub without well, as it said, showed here, in roughly half an hour's work. So let's get back to our threat model, our risks, controls, and mitigations. Primary threat, this is the broad one, that an attacker copies the contents of the device's physical media. The control here is to do encryption via the dencrypt kernel subsystem, and that ensures that the data, when it's at rest, can only be read if the attacker has the decryption key. Another threat related to reading the data from it is protecting IP. If you have some crucial algorithm you want to keep safe from your competitors, it can be a really good idea to use encryption to protect that, so that you don't, get it dumped, reverse engineered, and lose business value because of that. Same mitigation there. However, the obvious next question is, well, how do we decrypt it? So if you've used dencrypt on your PC, you're familiar with entering the disk decryption password when your laptop boots up. That's obviously not feasible or reasonable in an embedded device. So where do we keep the key? Is it just on disk somewhere? And that's where our third threat that I'm going to address here comes in, that the attacker dumps it. It's maybe encrypted, but the key itself is also somewhere in storage. And the control for this is to use hardware-bound encryption using either an independent chip or SoC features. And that ensures that the key can't be read unless, the attacker happens to be, the Chinese government with access to a scanning tunneling electron microscope. And even then, it's debatable whether some of these are. So for example, NXP's edge lock technology is common criteria EAL6 plus certified. It is impossible to read keys off of that thing. So how does that work? We're going to get back to the theory portion. For At-rest data encryption, at the core of it all, as I mentioned, is dencrypt and the kernel keyring. And the keyring has some pluggable trust modules. And what you do actually for this, there is a what's called key context blob that gets stored encrypted somewhere on the device. And that blob is what allows the kernel, the kernel can submit that blob to the hardware chip, so the TPM, the CAM module, the NXP edge lock, whatever it is you're using, can submit that key context blob to get the required key to actually decrypt the encrypted partition, and then the decrypt module decrypts data on the fly as it's used. And then from there, everything works the same way as you may be used to on your laptop. It's just that instead of requiring user intervention to store a password, you are relying on the authenticity of the hardware to decrypt it. So that means if you take the chip off, the attacker won't be able to do anything. The only way for that data to be decrypted is for the key inside the secure hardware to be used, and the only way to use the key inside the secure hardware is to boot a successful signed image, which you're also protecting and mitigating and controlling using the integrity protection mechanisms I mentioned in the first part. So that's it for theory. This one is, I think, just more straightforward and less complicated, but I did want to address the question of, well, where do the keys come from? Because I think it's an important one and something that's often not understood. So how do you implement this? Again, typically, if you're going to implement it, it can be a large project. This is one where there's a lot of possibility space. You have to decide, where is your root of trust coming from? Is it, a TPM, some external HSM? Are you can use a firmware TPM, some feature of the chip itself? If you're using something on the SoC, does your vendor's BSP actually include solid support for that hardware that you can rely on? And so because of that, the implementation time and cost can really vary quite widely, just because there's a lot of different architectural decisions to make. How do we do it at Toradex? Well, for this we use a nice modular design. We use the trusted keys kernel feature, so that lets us have swappable trust sources, trust anchors, depending on what you want to use and what's available. So you can use an external TPM. On any NXP module, you can use the CAM. Every one of them has it. You can also use a trusted execution environment. So we are currently working on expanding our support for this in more and more modules, but we may also make it quite easy to install OPT very early in the boot stage, also secured by Secure Boot and everything, which is a trusted execution environment leveraging ARM Trust Zone technology. So you have the secure world and secure trusted applications that execute there, that are completely separated from the normal world of where Linux is executing, with a hard boundary between them, such that the normal world can't access the memory of the secure world or anything like that. So again, here we chose an implementation that is opinionated but flexible. So we really try all the time to make these features very usable for kind of a pretty broad range of our customers. We have some customers who are, a small startup creating their first device, and other customers that have large engineering teams doing detailed platform work and implementation. So we always try to take that range into consideration. For our opinionated setup, we made it so that it's very easy to just create an encrypted partition, an auxiliary encrypted partition of a size of your choice that you can use for secret storage, everything like that. And it will auto mount when the device boots. And then the contents of that you manage with normal Linux permissions and principles. You can also do other things. Like I said, it's the absolute easiest path is this, but it's also quite flexible if you want to, have a complete encrypted partition and everything like that. All of the baseline work is done to support all of the hardware features and have the scaffolding for the software features. So you can do an implementation of your choice on top of it. So to do it, again, I've put a QR code and a link on this slide to our documentation on how to do this. It's pretty much like the secure boot story, except even easier. You choose which hardware backend you want to use. You add 3 lines of config to your Yocto build, saying which partition identifier you want it to use, what the size of the partition is, and where you want it to be mounted, and that's it. You're done. It's really genuinely that easy. All right, I've got less than 20 minutes left and 2 topics to cover, so I'm going to try to go kind of pick this up a little bit. The penultimate topic I want to cover is remote identity attestation at the application level. So we saw in the integrity section and secure boot section, it's often the case that we have this layered trust model, right? We start with some hardware root of trust, and we use that to load up a bootloader, a boot container, which then loads a kernel, which then loads an OS. In this diagram, I've even included a hypervisor in here. You have multiple stages that build on each other, and that is the correct architecture to use. But it means that in the end, your application is kind of far away from the hardware root of trust. Like we saw it here. If everything, if there are no vulnerabilities anywhere in this chain, you have complete integrity all the way through to your applications on the rootfs. But you are straying further from the ultimate root of trust, so there's sort of more opportunity for some bug, some exploitable bug somewhere in the stack to creep in and subvert that attestation. So what we'd like to be able to do is circuit this, and in the cases where we need to do it, have our applications trust the hardware root of trust directly. And it turns out we can't do that. So this is a really common use case. I didn't put a specific threat model and control section in here because I mean it's effectively the same as the threat model for any authentication credentials scenario. But the idea here is that we want to be able to remotely and securely attest device identity. This is a really common pattern. It's the recommended architecture from the Trusted Computing Group. And the basic idea is that if what you need to authenticate is proving the identity, the authenticity of the device, then you implement this pattern. Remote service sends some kind of a challenge. The application responds to the challenge by asking the hardware module to sign a response with a hardware-backed key that is signed by some PKI that you've set up when you provision the keys into the module. And then that proves that the application is running on a specific physical device. And it also proves that at the moment the challenge is done. So this is good and useful to have as a continuous authentication mechanism. Sometimes you see, provisioning methods that that piggyback one time off of a hardware root of trust, but then use it to store credentials that can then be reused later. It's generally the preferred architecture to actually have every authentication with the remote service be based on this hardware root of trust. And you will see this in excuse me, in the documentation for a number of connected services for IoT and things like this. You'll find it in cybersecurity recommendations and requirements documents for sensitive industries. It's just quite common. So how can we do this? Again, this is actually extremely similar to the case of doing an encrypted partition. It's just that we're taking it one step further. So where we saw with the, sorry for skipping around in the slides here, where we saw with the encrypted partition, we have the kernel reaching directly to the security chip, and then using the services of that chip to do the decryption. Here we just take it one layer further, and we expose the interface to the chip to Linux user space, and so you can again take this opportunity to use it in your application. And again, we've tried to do it in a way that's both straightforward but also flexible. So we've done all the hardware enablement for the security features of our modules. So out of the box, you can use the CAM. I mentioned before, you can we've done the integration of opt-t, and you can have opt-t and a firmware TPM running inside ARM trust zone, so that you can have a TPM with, even if you don't necessarily have TPM hardware on the board. Or if you have a TPM chip, as long as you enable it in your device tree, you can still use it. And the essential idea here is just that we're going to make that interface available to the application in whatever way is recommended by the particular architecture you're using. So you can find documentation on how to do certificate registration with a TPM for many services and things like that. And the idea with this is that you want to use mutual TLS for both authentication and securing transport security between the device and the remote services. But it wouldn't be such a good idea to have the service generate a certificate for you and send the device that cert over the air. That's possible, but it runs the risk of there being a man-in-the-middle attack, and the private key gets intercepted in transit or things like that. So with this flow, what you can do is generate a private key that you're going to use only for this application. You generate the private key inside the secure module, and then generate a certificate signing request. So you generate a certificate that binds the key to the device, again, all on the device side, and then you generate a certificate signing request and have the remote service just sign the certificate. And in this way, no key material, no secrets, nothing that you have to worry about protecting ever leaves the security chip. Everything is generated on board. All right. I see we are a little bit short on time for my favorite topic, but I will try to give just the very high-level overview of this, because, well, if you know me or have attended my talks before, you probably know that I can talk about this subject for literally hours. It is a hard requirement in the Cyber Resilience Act that you are able to do software updates. And your software update system needs to be secure. Now, having the capability of doing over-the-air software updates, and they do have to be over the air as long if the device has internet connectivity, because they have to be enabled and automatic by default. It's really crucial for protecting for the long-term security of a product. Realistically, over the lifetime of a product, you're going to have some security vulnerability that you need to patch, and to be able to patch it effectively and safely, you can't just, put an updated firmware on your website. You need to have a system for securely delivering it to the end devices. Even if they're not connected to the internet, you need a system to securely deliver it offline. Just sending out a USB stick and reflashing is not generally adequate. So here I want to talk mostly about threat models and comparing what's available in most software update systems on the market that you might be thinking about, and compare that to what we do in Torizon Cloud based on Uptane, which is a secure software update framework that comes from safety critical industry, well, from automotive, where software updates are extremely safety critical. So you often see in software update libraries like SW Update or Rauk or Mender, the security they implement is just they sign the artifact. So they implement kind of the same security practice that the early stage bootloader does in Secure Boot. And that is unfortunately not, it doesn't address a complete threat model. The threat model of a software update system is quite broad because the rewards for compromising it are so juicy. I mean, there have been a number of software supply chain and software update system attacks going back a couple of decades. But I mean, recently we had SolarWinds that had this massive economic impact. And there exist standards for how you should secure your software repository and how you should secure your devices. I'm not going to get into every one of these threats, but I will tell you that you don't want to have to go through each of these potential threats and implement a control for each of them on top of some like more bare bones update library like SW Update. You're probably going to miss something. It's better to follow a standard like Tough or Uptane, and this is what you get out of the box with Torizon and Torizon Cloud. I think I'm not going to go into too much more detail on this because I want to leave at least some time for Q&A here. Let me get this out here. Okay, so you can type your questions into the questions bar, and they will get sent to me. I'll try to address as many of these as possible. All right, this is one of my favorite questions. I'm just going to address it briefly. I had somebody ask, do the requirements of the LGPL conflict with the principles of integrity protection? As it relates to the LGPL, I think possibly GPL3's anti-TiVoization principles also present some license risk there. You should consult with legal counsel about what strategies you can take there. I have witnessed people using integrity protection and then meeting their obligations by offering a hardware swap program where you, when a user requests their rights under the LGPL or GPL3, you send them out the hardware without the integrity protection, but also without your proprietary software that you are protecting, to the extent that that's permitted by the license. But that is a strategy that can let you implement integrity protection on a system that uses base GPL3 components like Bash that you otherwise would have to, go to quite some trouble to get rid of. That's a topic for another day, though, so I'll leave it there. Is Secure Boot already available in a quarterly Torizon image, and for which sums? This is a great question, and I should have included a slide showing support. So, because you need to sign a Secure Boot image with your own keys, infuse your own keys, you do have to do the Yocto build yourself. We don't yet have support inside Torizon Core Builder for injecting a signature into a pre-built Toradex built binary image. That being said, as I alluded to, as I showed on the slide, it's quite easy to build the image. I strongly recommend doing it. If you look on our developer portal, there's a guide to building Torizon with Yocto using Docker. If you follow that, you're going to really find that building a Torizon core image is one command, and depending on how many cores you throw at it, anywhere from 30 minutes to hours of compile time. So you do have to build it from scratch, and the support level there for basically all of the songs on Torizon OS 7, it's already available, the full chain of trust. We're still working out some kinks with the ComposeFS parts, so that's available on the nightlies, but you can expect it in, I believe, for all of the Torizon OS supported songs in the forthcoming quarterly. But you can also, it's ready to use right now. You can also, we also do support a slightly more limited chain of trust on Kirkstone, so that's Torizon OS 6. For all modules, you can also use Secure Boot there, but for Torizon OS, that doesn't extend all the way to the rootfs protection. If you're building your own Yocto image from BSP and you prefer to use DM Verity, then both BSP 6 and BSP 7 are supported. How much CPU power do you add with the de-encrypt method? So like, what's the performance overhead for this? I have heard it, and so obviously it in terms of raw numbers, it varies depending on the module, but it's even on the lowest powered modules, it's very small. It's on the order of a maximum of 2 or 3% for fairly heavy access. So that the actual decryption is done with a fast symmetric algorithm, and it doesn't take up a lot of resources. You can benchmark it yourself. This also, of course, depends on the data throughput that you're reading. Are the secure options that are described for Yocto also available for Torizon Core Builder? That is on our roadmap. Yeah, that we want very much to have to make the secure boot tooling even more accessible. I think it's very usable and accessible today using Yocto, but it's an active research topic for doing this signature injection from within Torizon Core Builder. As far as we're aware, nobody has done something like that yet. So it's something that we're having to work on from scratch. It will be coming. This is a very good question, one that's close to my heart. Automotive regulations. You got to show the backup camera in less than 2 seconds from power on. Can you support fast boot times and still maintain a root of trust? The answer is yes, but you sure as heck can't do it on a Linux system. So what you would typically do in automotive for those really absolutely critical elements is you have the M series processor, or alternatively a static partitioning hypervisor that is loading something that can go a lot faster. If your boot time budget is less than 2 seconds to displaying a real-time video feed, there's just no chance you can get that with Linux. I mean, you can try to do it with some extreme tricks, but it's not. You can't guarantee it. It's not worth trying. Use a different architecture. It's very possible with a more restricted OS, though. We're a little over time. I'll try and answer a couple of more questions here, though. Let me see. What about if I plan to use a Torizon OS with my application running in a container? That is a very good question. Right now, with what's available today for access time, for continuous integrity protection, we don't have a method for doing continuous integrity protection with Docker containers that are delivered over the air. There's just an inherent limitation in that. This is a topic of active research. There's a team from Red Hat is using a similar approach that we're taking for our rootfs integrity in Torizon, that is using ComposeFS for container image layering and having that as root of trust. So we're looking at that as a future topic, and when it's more widely available and stable, we will probably look at integrating it. For now, what you get for integrity protection for Docker is install time integrity. And if you wish to additionally supplement that by and have startup time integrity, you can implement that with a systemd service. So by default, when Docker starts, it doesn't recheck the verity of images. It only does that when the images are initially loaded. And everything in the chain of trust in our software update system supports you in that. What you can do if you have more stringent requirements, at the penalty, it should be said, of slower application load times on first boot, you can implement a service that does an integrity check at boot time. It really depends on what your threat model is, of course. And I think I will. Okay, I'm going to briefly address one last question here. How would you safely secure the private keys for everything in the chain of trust to avoid risk of compromise? That is not a question that I can answer in just a few minutes. What you need is a combination of human controls, so good security practices, and proper technical solutions. The ideal scenario is that you, especially for those super root keys, the ones that you fuse into the board and you use for signing the bootloader, the most recommendable practice would be to always only use those keys on an air-gapped system. So that you only need to use those keys for building the boot container, which you shouldn't need to update very often at all. So you can, keep them on a smart card or a YubiKey or some hardware security device. Keep them, the keys themselves, in that hardware device offline in a vault somewhere. And then only get them out and sign your boot container under very controlled circumstances. But you have to decide what your risk appetite is and what your threat model is. So it is the case that many people choose to have those keys on build systems or even CI systems. I personally don't think that's very recommendable, but it really all comes down to the threat model and the risks you're willing to accept. And of course, the risk of compromise of a super root key is that the campaign to revoke and rotate is going to be a tricky and potentially expensive one. With if something goes wrong, there's a risk of recalls and everything like that. So you just got to do the balancing act. I would like to eventually develop some documentation and guidance on that we could supply. That's something that I do have significant experience with, both from my work with the Obtain Standards Committee and in automotive. There are a lot of practices around it. The most important thing are the human controls, is the main thing that I would say. And I think with that, I'm going to stop because we're already 6 minutes over time. Thank you, everybody, for joining. I hope you found it helpful. And yeah, stay tuned for the next one. I think there will probably be more in this series, seeing as how I didn't even get to application security yet. Goodbye.